Hi and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to talk about Robbie Hawkins and how he took the life of several people at the shopping mall. But before we get into today's case, a quick reminder of the trigger warnings for today's case, which are struggle with mental health issues, depression, as well as murder and suicide. So without any further ado, let's get on to the video. Robbie Hawkins was born on the 17th of May in 1988 in Suffolk in England to his parents Molly and Ronald. Robbie's parents met in 1982 when Molly was 16 years old working in a mall in San Angelo, Texas, while Ronald was working in the Air Force Electronic Warfare, and that's when Ronald would walk into the store. The two met and immediately fell for each other, and just a few months after knowing each other, the two would end up exchanging their vows. Shortly after the wedding, Molly and Ronald would welcome their first daughter, Cynthia, to the world. Now, I'm not all too sure date-wise when it happened, but after the birth of Cynthia, Ronald was transferred to a base in Suffolk in England. But once the family had settled into their new life, the relationship between Molly and Ronald started to crumble. With a new baby and a new surrounding, things became pretty heated to the point where Ronald would insult his wife, saying that she wasn't hot anymore and that she just wasn't trying hard enough. And Molly, to get back at Ronald, started to cheat on her husband with some of the soldiers that were also stationed at the base. Somewhere around in 1987, Molly had fallen pregnant with her second child, Robbie, and she had really hoped that this new baby would somehow magically cure her marriage. But after Robbie's birth, things started to escalate even more, to the point where Molly and Ronald would get into literal fights with each other. And once Robbie had entered into preschool, his behavior had started to become very problematic. Robbie would start to get into fights with other kids. He would even kick some of them in their groin, and when teachers tried to get in between and try to discipline, Robbie would bite the teachers. One time, Robbie went up to one of his teachers and he really disliked this teacher. So he went up to her and slammed her head into a door. And just to remind you, he is in preschool. So that means that he's only 3 years old when his behavior starts to escalate. Also around that time is when Molly and Ronald decided that it would be the best for them to get a divorce. And Ronald soon met a woman called Candice, who he fell in love with. The only problem was that from the moment that Robbie had met Candice, he immediately despised her. And you'll know what I mean by that in a second. In 1992, Ronald moved with his new family to an Air Force base in Omaha, Nebraska. And Robbie, who was around 4 years old at the time, his behavior just kept getting out of hand, so much so that his father took him to a psychiatrist asking what he should do with his son. When the doctors asked Robbie why he kept on hurting the other kids, he replied, "Because I'm stupid and bad." And that's when the doctors diagnosed him with attention deficit disorder, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And also decided it would be the best to admit 4-year-old Robbie to be able to observe him. Robbie was sent home from the hospital after a month, and the doctors told Ronald that it was necessary to ensure Robbie's recovery, for him to continue therapy and to take his meds, and also to have a stable and loving family life. But this wouldn't be the case, as Ronald and his ex-wife Molly were still in a very ugly custody battle over Robbie. Molly one time was even removed in handcuffs because she was threatening Candice, Ronald's new wife, even though Molly by that time was also remarried to a guy called Mark, who was a former friend of Ronald. So the whole thing is just getting messier and messier. And Robbie is witnessing all of that, and eventually his mom just gave up on him. Molly wanted to start her own family with her new husband Mark. So she stopped fighting for the custody of Robbie, and since his mom basically abandoned him, Robbie started to hate Candice even more. And once Robbie turned 13 years old, he started to smoke and was completely driven by anger and hate. So much so that he even poisoned Candice at one point. He gave her a drink which was laced with pesticide. Thankfully though, Candice noticed a weird taste after the first sip and stopped drinking it. But later that night she had gotten extremely sick and found out that her stepson had poisoned her. She confronted Robbie, asking why he would do something like that. But to her horror, he just laughed and said, "Well, you're still alive, aren't you?" There was also another incident where Candice was going through Robbie's room and his backpack looking for cigarettes because he was still 13 years old. And once Robbie caught Candice going through his stuff, he just freaked out on her. Candice, who I'm sure by that point was at her wits' ends, slapped Robbie across the face, and her ring actually ended up cutting him on his face. In that moment, Robbie balled up his fists really tight and in a perfectly calm voice said to Candice that he was going to kill her. Now after this threat, and considering that Robbie had already poisoned her once, Candice took this very seriously. She was scared for her life and insisted that Robbie went back to the hospital to receive further treatment. So on his 14th birthday, Robbie was sent back to the hospital where he was put on even more medication and in therapy, where the family would sit with a doctor, and this doctor insisted on Robbie apologizing to Candice. But he just sat there not saying a word. Robbie just refused to acknowledge what had happened and only said that he hoped that they would get into a car accident because once the doctors released him, the only way Candice would leave the house would be in a body bag. So Robbie just keeps on feeding into his anger and resentment, and after his continuous threats, he ended up staying at the hospital for over a year. In 2002, it was Mother's Day, and all the patients were given cards to draw for their families. Well, you can only guess what Robbie had drawn for Candice. And not all too long after that, Ronald went up to the juvenile court where he asked the judge to take over his son. And the reason that he made that request was that his health insurance was running out. And Ronald just simply couldn't afford to keep up with the bills. And Molly, since she now had her own little family, wasn't even at this hearing, so she had no idea what was happening. After the request, within the next 8 months, Ronald was no longer the legal guardian of his son Robbie, but the State Department of Health and Human Service. And for the next 2 years, really, Robbie would spend most of the time in and out of health facilities. At one point, Robbie had to be transferred because he started a fight with another patient. But this time he was transferred into a much stricter facility with stricter rules where he was isolated most of the time. Robbie was desperately trying to get into contact with his mother Molly, but was never allowed to call her because, as far as I understand, they had a no contact clause. And his condition just kept on getting worse and worse. By 16 he was underweight, depressed, struggled with the thought of ending it all, and he was also diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which makes it hard for the person having it to feel any kind of empathy or sympathy for others. Robbie, in an attempt to cope with everything, started to draw and also, well, I don't want to say worshipping, but he developed a fascination with Satan. And meanwhile, the doctors were still trying to get Robbie to finally apologize to Candice, and even giving him an ultimatum where if Robbie didn't apologize to his stepmother, he would be transferred to yet another institution. And once Robbie heard that, he threatened to burn the whole place down with everyone inside if they dared to transfer him. There was a meeting set up with the family in 2004 where Robbie actually did apologize to Candice and asked for her forgiveness. But for Candice, it was clear that he was only apologizing because the doctors told him to. So she said clearly that she would accept his apology, and if Ronald dared to bring Robbie back into the home, she would get a divorce because she just didn't feel safe anymore, and frankly, after everything that Robbie had already done to her, she was scared for her life. Now, Robbie had a roommate called Dallas, and over time they'd gotten pretty close together, where they even had sworn an oath. They had these purple bracelets that they wore and called themselves the Purple Skulls. And one thing that the doctor noticed was that as long as Rob and Dallas were together, they didn't cause nearly as much trouble as they would being apart. And as for Robbie, he started to kind of open up to his newfound friend. He started to talk about how much he actually missed his mother Molly and how desperately he wanted to see her. Now, regarding Molly, since she did disappear from his life early on, well, her marriage had fallen apart, as did her life. She was, well, I don't know if dating is the right word for it, but she was with a few men at once, not really knowing what she was going to do and really just losing all and any stability that she had. In December in 2004, Robbie was transferred to a foster home which was owned by a woman called Marty Glass. Marty had a total of 10 children herself, but that didn't stop her from taking up 2,000 kids and trying to help them. And once Robbie arrived at Marty's home, he, maybe even for the first time in his life, felt appreciated and understood. And he even started to spend a lot of time doing garden work outside Marty's home. Although things are now starting to get better, Robbie was still struggling. He started to attend the 4th Cullen High School, but just kept on failing to keep up, and on top of that, Robbie was now also starting to commit petty theft by robbing gas stations and even selling weed to middle school children. But despite everything, he would tell people that the winter where he would stay with Marty was the best time of his entire life. And also, while living with Marty, he was allowed to make phone calls because while being stationed at the different facilities, he was never allowed access to a phone. Robbie called up his sister, well, actually half-sister, and convinced her to give him the phone number of Molly, which she did, and Robbie, without hesitation, called this number up. It was actually his stepfather, Mark, who answered the phone, and Robbie asked him, "Do you remember a man by the name of Robbie Hawkins?" To which Mark just answered yes and handed the phone over to Molly. Now, Molly at first was very confused to who she was speaking until Robbie said, "Mommy, it's me, Robbie." Molly, in a complete shock, replied, "Oh my God, Robbie, how are you? Where are you?" A few days after the phone call, Molly went over to Marty Glass' house, where she sat with her son on the porch, and Robbie was actually sitting on her knee as Molly was bouncing him up and down as if Robbie was still that young boy that she had abandoned. And Marty, who happened to see the interaction, approached Molly and told her, "You really shouldn't treat him like a baby." To which Molly only responded by saying, "But he is my baby boy," and Robbie seemed to be doing whatever Molly wanted him to. She convinced him to get a haircut since Robbie had long black hair, so he cut it off by his mom's request, and Molly even bought Robbie a used Jeep Cherokee, telling him that he could keep it as long as he promised that he would graduate from high school and not drop out. Robbie went to court again regarding whether or not he could go back home, and he was dressed in a nice shirt and tie. The judge even told him that he was very proud of his progress, but he still could not return back home since his stepmother Candace still refused to live together in a house with him. And Ronald was on the side of his wife, which made the judge so mad that he actually started to yell at Ronald and Candace that it was not the responsibility of the State Department of Health and Human Service to raise their child. So Robbie was sent back to Marty Glass, and he went to his caseworker and asked him if it was possible to live with his mother Molly. But Molly didn't want his son living with her. She said that she was also scared of her son because she knew exactly how his father could be and that she couldn't take the risk of possibly endangering her other kids, which were all girls. Molly was really scared that Robbie might hurt them. And once Robbie heard that his mother pretty much was abandoning him for a second time now, he broke off all contact with her for almost 2 years. Now, skipping time a little to December 2005, because that's when Robbie, who was now 17 years old by now, was finally allowed back home after his stepmother Candice and his father Ronald had decided to end their marriage. So Robbie, after years, is finally back home with his dad. And he really wanted to work, but because he had dropped out of high school prior, he wasn't able to get a job. Robbie also didn't have a driver's license, so he also wasn't able to drive a car. And he also still struggled very much to socialize. And he was at one point even arrested and put under house arrest for smoking weed. On the 21st of August in 2006, Robbie attended another court hearing where he managed to convince the judge to set him free. I guess basically he has to be released under state supervision. And even Robbie's caseworker told the judge that there was no benefit anymore on either end, so the judge granted Robbie's request. Only a few months later though, Robbie left Ronald's home, and I don't know if something had happened or why he decided to leave, but he left and started to sleep in a car. In the same month that Robbie moved out, he was roaming around with a good friend of his called Will. And after they finished partying, both of the boys were pretty drunk, and Robbie decided to just sleep at the front porch of Will's home. Deborah, Will's mom, saw Robbie lying there in her garden, and she knew that he was homeless and had no money, and she actually felt so bad for him that she allowed him to stay with them, so that he wouldn't be sleeping in cars or on floors anymore. And Robbie really appreciated Deborah being so kind to him. According to Deborah, Robbie followed her almost like a lost puppy. He liked being near her, and she also helped him to get a few jobs in order to get his life back on tracks. And Robbie, while staying with Deborah, even managed to make some small changes. He even found himself a new group of friends where he was described as the dorky but funny friend from this group. And within the first few months being in this new environment, Robbie also gotten his driver's license, but he still wasn't able to afford a car. So Robbie decided to ask Ronald if he could help him out, which he did. Ronald had gotten him a white Cadillac, and Robbie was extremely happy and excited because this was quote-unquote the first thing that he really owned. And that, I guess, inspired him even more so because he started to work at the McDonald's to pay his dad back for the car. So things are really starting to look great for Robbie. He's finally starting to have some consistency in his life. And he even met and got together with his first girlfriend called Casey. It is said that as soon as the couple had met, they became inseparable. If they weren't together, they would always talk with each other on the phone. And Casey said that she really saw a different side of Robbie. He loved her and trusted her so much that he started to show her his vulnerable side. Casey also said that Robbie cried a lot due to the fact that his mother abandoned him, not only once but twice, and he felt like he had no family at all. But as good as things sound right now, trouble was on the rise as Robbie was still smoking weed and drinking constantly. So the only money that he was left with was $50 that he had to pay Deborah as rent money. And Deborah was actually thinking of charging him more since she provided all the food and necessities. She thought that he barely spent any of his money. And since the McDonald's where he worked didn't pay all that great, Robbie even started to apply to every place that he could find, but just kept on getting rejected. So he came up with the idea to go to the army. And he was actually really excited. Robbie also told all of his friends that he was looking forward to being in the army and that his goal was to become a general. But with his medical record, he was also rejected. And this rejection really took a toll on him. Robbie was again becoming really depressed, and his friends started to worry about him, as he would now say weird things that he never said before. Robbie was now saying, since no one was willing to give him a chance, neither was he, and he was going to take everyone out. And his criminal life also started to come back to life, as he borrowed $400 worth of weed in an attempt to sell it, but Robbie just ended up smoking all of it by himself. And a little while later, Robbie took all that money that he had left and bought weed in yet another attempt to sell it, but he actually got robbed. And after that incident, he was just a mess. Robbie went to Dallas, the boy he shared a room with at one of the mental facilities, and he was just a crying mess. Robbie told Dallas what had happened and that he now owed a lot of money to some people, and that he just didn't see the point in living anymore. After that talk, Robbie just kind of started to isolate himself again, and a year later, in September in 2007, his depression was worse than ever. So, in a desperate attempt, Robbie decided to once again reach out to his birth mother, Molly. And just like last time, Molly was just too happy to hear from her baby boy, and immediately she was back in his life yet again. Molly, who was financially stable since her ex-husband paid her rent, and another man that she was seeing was also providing for her here and there, she was determined to help her son out. She convinced Robbie to sell his beloved Cadillac, since it was too expensive for him to keep, and she gave him the Jeep that she had promised him if he graduated from high school. But just a few days later, Robbie was arrested for drinking in his car with two of his friends and was charged for suspicion of contributing to the declarancy of a minor, and also two alcohol charges, one of which was underage possession of alcohol. And that freaked Robbie completely out, because he was sure that given his past record, he was definitely going to jail. And from this point on, everything just went downhill. At first, Robbie threatened one of his neighbors, who I believe was around the same age as he was, saying that she stole a CD player from him and that he was going to kill her if she didn't return it. And this poor girl was terrified of Robbie. Not only didn't she steal anything, but everyone knew just how bad Robbie's temper could get. So she decided it would be the best to just drop it and try to avoid him. After that, Robbie started to cheat on Casey with his co-worker at McDonald's. And after Casey found out about that, Robbie just kept on being hot and cold with her, where I think he himself couldn't decide if he wanted Casey to forgive him or not. Robbie did go to his mom for advice, and boy oh boy is this woman driving me nuts. Instead of talking to her son and being a parent to him, she just said that Casey was overreacting, but that's just typical of her. And just a quick side note, I'm not even sure if Molly and Casey have even met each other once. I'm pretty sure that they haven't. But yeah, she tells Robbie that at 19 years old, he's not supposed to be faithful, that he needs to test the waters a little, and if Casey really loved him, she would understand. And Robbie took the advice from his mother. He called Casey and told her that he was going to continue to see this co-worker of his, and he wasn't really all that nice to her on the phone. And poor Casey was just completely devastated. She asked Robbie why he was hurting her like this, to which Robbie just replied that it was just a general tough time for him and that he was planning on ending his life. Upon hearing that, Casey was just shocked and furious, because her last two boyfriends had also taken their lives. So this was a really sensitive subject for Casey. So she decided that it would be the best for the two of them to just break up with each other. So after Casey broke up with him, Robbie went over to have dinner at Molly's house, and he was still very depressed and told his mom, like, I feel really bad for what I did to Casey. She didn't deserve it all, to which Molly just replies, Well, if you feel guilty about it, maybe you shouldn't have done that. Robbie also admits that he was fired because apparently there was some money missing while it was Robbie's shift. And after the dinner, Molly sat with her son on the computer and started looking for a new job for Robbie, but left shortly after to run a few errands, leaving her son alone. And Robbie just waited for the opportunity because as soon as Molly left, he went to her bedroom and took his stepfather's AK-47. He covered it up and put it into his Jeep before returning back into the house, where he sat on the couch and started listening to music on his iPod. Molly returned about half an hour later and Robbie didn't say anything, but he hugged her really tight and then he left the house and went back to Will and Deborah where he still lived. Robbie actually showed Will the AK-47 that he stole from his stepfather, and Will actually took a photo of it and sent it to a few of his friends. The next morning, on the 5th of December in 2007, Molly called the house of Deborah and left a message for her son to immediately call her back. And Robbie didn't seem bothered at all that his mom caught him and promised Molly that he'll return it, but instead he started writing notes. In the first one, he apologized to his family about being such a burden and disappointment to them, and that now they are finally better off without him, and to remember the few good times that they shared, and ended the note with "I love you." The second note he wrote to his friends apologizing about what he has done to them, apologizing about the kind of person that he is, and that he hopes that when his friends do think about him, that they won't remember him as a monster. The third and last note was actually his will, where he wrote that the Jeep should be returned back to Molly and that his friends can have whatever was left of his. After he was finished, he placed those notes on his bed and drove to his friend Dallas. The boys played video games for a while before Robbie started crying and confiding in his friend about all the things that were wrong with him. The fact that he was probably going to jail and he didn't have any money. That the girl he was so in love with left him, and he also said to Dallas that he was kind of scared of his mom. But Dallas reassured him that he was there for him, and Robbie asked him if he could make a phone call, to which Dallas said of course. Robbie called Will and apologized for everything that he's ever done, and Will got his mom Deborah on the phone because he knew that Robbie has been thinking about taking his own life. So Deborah tried her best to calm him down and reassure him that everything is going to be alright, but Robbie stopped her and just thanked her for everything that she's ever done for him and that he was so sorry. Robbie also called his mom Molly, but since she didn't answer, he left her a voicemail and then texted his new girlfriend and his ex-girlfriend Casey, where he wrote that he loved them and he apologized for everything. He handed Dallas his phone back and hugged him. And Dallas said that after Robbie left, he turned on the TV because he thought that if Robbie really did something, it surely would be on the news. At the same time, Molly was looking for her son. She thought that he was going to sell the gun to get his hands on some money. Molly even called Dallas and told him, if you see Robbie, don't let him out of your sight. On her way to the police station, Molly realized that she had a message from Robbie, and that really made Molly concerned. And whilst Molly was looking for her son, Robbie had driven to Westwoods Mall in Omaha, Nebraska, where he walked into the south entrance at 2:36 p.m. After walking around the mall for a bit, he left to go grab the AK-47 along with two 30-round magazines. Robbie then re-entered the mall, where he took the elevator to the top floor. And since it was close to Christmas, the mall was full of people who were doing their Christmas shopping. Robbie took the gun out from under his shirt and walked over to the 7 to 16-year-old section, where two women named Maggie Webb, who was the store manager, and Angie Schuster, who was the manager of the children's department, were standing. Robbie walked up to them and shot both women, killing them instantly. And as soon as the people heard the shot, panic started to break out as everyone started to run around and scream in sheer terror. Next, Robbie shot a guy named Jeff Schaefer who was looking for a nice dress for his 2-year-old in his arm, injuring him, but thankfully he would survive. The next victim was a man by the name of Gary Scharf, who was actually just trying to help a woman off the elevator. Robbie also shot him, taking his life instantly. Robbie then leaned over a balcony and from 40 feet away proceeded to shoot and kill a man by the name of Gary Joy. After taking Gary's life, Robbie made his way toward the gift department, where he shot and killed 67-year-old saleswoman by the name of Janet Jorgensen. As he headed to the customer service desk, where a worker by the name of Teenage Rand was hiding, he actually made the call 911. Meanwhile, Robbie proceeded to shoot 4 more people by the names of Diane, who was 53 years old, Mickey Oldham, who was 65 years old, Beverly Flynn, who was 47 years old, and Fred Wilson, who was 61 years old. Diane and Beverly unfortunately ended up losing their lives, but Fred and Mickey somehow ended up surviving. Next, Robbie came across a man called John McDonald, who was 65 years old, and he was hiding with his wife behind a chair. John also lost his life by the hands of Robbie, and after that, Robbie Hawkins, I guess, decided that he caused enough damage and took his own life. The autopsy would later show that Robbie did smoke some weed prior to his actions, but that he was all in a clear mind space when he committed his awful crimes. And I want to end the video by honoring the victims of today's case, and I want to take the time to talk about them so that we can get a better look on who they were. Maggie Webb, who was 24 years old, had just recently become the manager at the mall, and she had started working at this mall when she was just a senior in high school. Maggie is described to be very sweet and bubbly, and she had also a lot of friends and family who love and miss her deeply. Angie Schuster was 36 years old, and she was the manager in the girls department, and she was working there for about 10 years. Angie had a sister and a lot of friends, and also a new man that she had met shortly before the shooting. So she was very happy in her life before Robbie decided to take it all away from her. Angie also graduated from college and actually planned to become an elementary teacher, but because she didn't have any luck in finding a position, that's when she started to work at the mall. Gary Scharf was 48 years old, and he was a very successful sales manager in the AG chemical industry. And Gary just returned home from a business trip when he decided to stop at the mall. Gary is also described as a very kind-hearted man who was never too shy to help anyone in need. Gary Joy, who was 56 years old and for a long time also the janitor at the mall, he also graduated from college and received a degree in literature. Gary loved to write poems and stories, and he is described as a hard-working, reliable man. Janet Jorgensen was 66 years old. She was working at the gift department since the store opened, and she is described as an outgoing, extroverted person. Janet was married and had children that now had to cope without their mother. Diane originally was an airline stewardess, but because she wanted to be closer to her family since her husband Pete unexpectedly passed away, Diane decided to take it easier, and that's when she started to work at the mall. Beverly Flynn was 47 years old, and she was working as a gift wrapper and also a real estate agent. Beverly was also married and had children. And the final victim is John McDonald, who was 65 years old and retired 7 years prior to the shooting. John had 2 children with his wife, whom he was married for 40 years, by the name of Kathleen, and she was actually also at the mall with her husband. They were waiting for the presents to be wrapped when they heard the gunshot. John and his wife were hiding behind a chair, but that didn't stop Robbie from killing John right in front of his wife. So yeah, that's it for today's heavy case. Robbie's actions can never be excused, and the damage he had caused to so many people. And I can only hope that the family and friends of the victims are doing okay. So yeah, as always, please let me know your thoughts on this case and also case suggestions in the comment section down below. I hope I see you all in my next video. Take care. Bye.